You ever watch Ice Road Truckers? I used to love that show. Something about those guys driving rigs over frozen lakes and icy roads always got my adrenaline pumping. But let me tell you, real life on winter roads? It's not TV. There's no camera crew to save you if things go south. I've been trucking for over a decade now, and I thought I'd seen it all. Storms, breakdowns, sketchy highways. But one winter, I learned just how wrong I was. It happened on a road I knew like the back of my hand. A road I'd driven hundreds of times without a second thought. I was working local runs back then, hauling goods between Milwaukee and Green Bay, Wisconsin. The job was perfect. I'd be home almost every night with my wife and little girl. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I didn't have to spend weeks on the road like most truckers. The route was familiar, easy even, until that winter. The news wouldn't shut up about how bad the season was going to be. Record cold, black ice warnings almost every night. For a trucker, black ice is the stuff of nightmares. You can't see it, you can't predict it, and if you hit it at the wrong angle, you're done. I knew I'd have to be extra careful this time of year, even on Crawford Street, my regular route. Crawford's a scenic stretch that cuts through the hills, a beautiful drive when the weather's good. But in winter, it turns into a death trap. It's long, winding, and isolated, the kind of road where help feels a million miles away. The night started like any other. I loaded my rig, checked the tires, and hit the road. The air was bitterly cold, and my breath fogged up the inside of the cab despite the heater blasting full tilt. As I approached Crawford Street, I noticed something strange, a thick fog rolling in, swallowing the trees and the road ahead. I'd driven in fog before, but this was different. It clung to the ground like it had weight, muffling everything around me. I turned on my fog lights and slowed down, gripping the wheel a little tighter. The road felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it. Standing on the shoulder of the road, barely visible through the fog, was a figure. They were tall, wearing a long coat with the hood pulled up. My headlights caught the faintest glint of their face, pale and unmoving. "Great," I muttered. "A hitchhiker? Out here?" As I passed, I glanced in my side mirror, but they were gone. Just gone. My heart kicked up a notch, but I told myself they'd stepped back into the woods. That's all it was. Nothing to worry about. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. It told me this night was just getting started. The fog thickened as I climbed into the hills, and the temperature dropped even lower. The road shimmered in my headlights, and I knew I was driving on borrowed time. Black ice was out there, waiting to catch me off guard. Halfway up Crawford, I felt the first skid. My back tire slid just enough to make my heart leap into my throat. I eased off the accelerator, correcting the wheel, and managed to keep the rig steady. But then out of nowhere, the hooded figure was back. This time, they weren't on the shoulder. They were standing in the middle of the road, arms at their sides, staring straight at me. "Are you kidding me?" I yelled, slamming on the brakes. The truck groaned as it slowed, but the road was too slick. My tires lost their grip, and the whole rig started to slide toward the figure. I swerved at the last second, narrowly avoiding them, but as I passed, I swear I saw their face. It wasn't human. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and a twisted, toothy grin that didn't belong on this earth. I checked my mirror again, my pulse hammering. Nothing. The road behind me was empty. I couldn't stop shaking as I drove on, my mind racing. Who or what was that? Was I losing it? The cab felt colder than it should have, and no matter how high I cranked the heat, the chill wouldn't go away. Then it happened. The tires on the passenger side hit a patch of black ice, and the truck lurched hard to the right. I fought the wheel, trying to straighten out, but the trailer was skidding, pulling me with it. The guardrail loomed ahead, and I knew I wasn't going to stop in time. Metal screamed as the truck tore through the barrier. For a split second, everything was weightless. Then the cab hit the slope, rolling once, twice before landing on its side in the snow. The windshield shattered, and shards of glass rained down on me as I hung from my seatbelt, stunned and bleeding. I managed to unbuckle myself and crawl out through the broken window. My body ached and the cold air stung my face, but I was alive. That's when I looked up the hill and saw them again. The hooded figure standing next to the mangled guardrail watching. They raised a hand pointing down at me, and for the first time I heard their voice. It was low, guttural, and wrong in every way. "This is your road now." I didn't stick around to find out what they meant. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move, stumbling through the snow. I needed help, and fast. My radio was dead, my phone had no signal, and the woods were suffocatingly silent. That's when I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. A cabin. It looked old and run down, but I didn't care. I just needed to get inside, away from the cold. I banged on the door, but no one answered. The place seemed abandoned, but the door creaked open when I pushed it. Inside, the air was stale and freezing, and the flickering light came from a single lantern on a table. Spread across the table were maps, photographs, and yellowed newspapers. The headlines made my stomach turn. Trucker found dead on Crawford Street. Local road claims another life. The curse of the watcher. Every photo showed the same hooded figure standing in the background of each crash site, just like I'd seen. My hands were shaking as I picked up one of the papers. That's when I heard it. The crunch of footsteps in the snow right outside the cabin. I spun around, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and a familiar voice echoed through the cabin. "You took my road. Now it takes you." The door burst open, and there they were, standing in the doorway. But this time they weren't just a shadow. Their hollow face was clearer, their grin wider, and their presence heavier, like they were sucking the air out of the room. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a rusted fire poker, and swung it as they stepped closer. The poker passed right through them like smoke, but their grin never wavered. "You can't run," they said, their voice echoing in my skull. "You can't hide." But I wasn't giving up. I bolted out the back door into the snow, running toward the faint glow of headlights on the road above. The figure didn't chase me. They didn't need to. Their voice followed me, growing louder with every step. "This is your road. It will always be your road." I stumbled onto the highway just as a police cruiser came into view. The officer jumped out, shining a flashlight in my face. "You okay? What happened?" I turned to point at the cabin, but it was gone. Just trees and snow like it had never been there. I told the cops everything, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to shock, maybe a concussion. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. I don't drive Crawford Street anymore. Hell, I barely drive at night. Times when the air gets cold and the fog rolls in. I swear I can still hear that voice. "This is your road now." Some memories never fade, no matter how young you were when they happened. For me, this one's like a vivid dream I can't shake off. I was just 4 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of my mom's car, on a trip that changed everything. My mom used to tell this story over the years, and every time it felt like the details became sharper, clearer, more chilling. We were road warriors back then. My family had relatives scattered across the country. So we spent a lot of time driving through endless highways, stopping at gas stations and roadside diners. It was usually peaceful, the kind of quiet where you can almost hear the hum of the tires on the road. But not that trip. That trip was different. It was just me and Mom. My dad stayed home with my siblings, and honestly, I didn't mind. I loved having Mom to myself. She was always the calm one, the one who made me feel safe no matter where we were. We were driving through Arizona, on our way to visit my aunt in Albuquerque. I remember staring out the window, watching the jagged mountains blur past. The sky was huge and cloudless, this endless stretch of blue. We'd been driving for hours when Mom decided to stop at a rest area just outside Flagstaff. It was one of those isolated spots you see in the middle of nowhere, with a few parking spaces, some vending machines, and a grimy bathroom. Nothing about it screamed danger, but even as a kid, I felt something was wrong. Then I saw him. A man was leaning against his car near the entrance, and he wasn't just standing there. He was watching. Not casually glancing around, but really watching, like he was waiting for something. Mom noticed him too, Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she parked, but she didn't say anything. "Stay close," she said softly, grabbing my hand as we walked toward the restroom. I've always been a friendly kid. Back then I'd hug strangers and tell them I loved them without hesitation. But with him, I felt something deep in my chest, like my body was telling me to stay away. As we walked past him, his eyes followed us. I let go of Mom's hand and moved to her other side, putting her between me and the man. Mom later told me she'd never seen me act like that before. Not before that day, and not since. Inside, Mom hurried me through the restroom, constantly glancing over her shoulder. When we came out, the man was still there, leaning against his car like he'd been waiting for us. Mom didn't hesitate. She grabbed my hand, practically dragged me to our car, and started the engine. But as we pulled onto the highway, I noticed something in the mirror. He was following us. At first, Mom tried to stay calm. She told me to sit back, buckle up, and not worry. But I could see her hands shaking on the wheel. Every time she changed lanes, the man's car followed. I turned in my seat to get a better look. His car was old and dusty, with a crack running through the windshield. He was close enough that I could see his face, expressionless, cold. Mom pressed her foot harder on the gas. The road stretched endlessly ahead, lined with nothing but desert and the occasional tumbleweed. She tried to lose him, weaving between cars and taking unexpected turns. But no matter what she did, he stayed right on our tail. "What does he want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom didn't answer. She just kept driving, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Then, out of nowhere, a massive semi-truck appeared beside us. The truck was huge, its headlights glowing like twin suns in the growing darkness. The driver looked down at us and I saw him nod slightly, like he understood exactly what was happening. He grabbed his CB radio, and within minutes, more trucks began appearing. They came from every direction, forming a wall of steel around the man's car. I didn't understand what was happening, but I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. Mom eased off the gas as the trucks surrounded us, keeping the man's car boxed in. One of the truckers, a tall man with a scruffy beard and a worn cap, signaled for us to pull over. Mom followed him to the next exit, and we stopped at a gas station just outside Gallup, New Mexico. The trucker introduced himself as Jack. He was calm, steady, like nothing could rattle him. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Mom nodded, but her voice shook when she said, "I think so. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't..." Jack raised a hand, cutting her off. "You're safe now, that's all that matters." Jack insisted on getting us something to eat before we hit the road again. He took us to a diner nearby, the kind with neon signs flickering in the windows and faded red booths. Over burgers and fries, Mom told Jack everything. How the man had followed us from the rest stop, how he wouldn't back off, how scared she was. Jack listened quietly, nodding every now and then. When she finished, he leaned back in his seat and said, "You did the right thing. People like him, they're predators. They wait for someone to be vulnerable." His words sent a chill down my spine. Even as a kid, I knew this wasn't just a random encounter. After we ate, Jack said he'd follow us for a while to make sure we were safe. His truck was a comforting presence in the rearview mirror as we got back on the highway. The miles passed in silence, the hum of the tires lulling me into a strange kind of calm. But then, without warning, Jack's truck vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. "Where did he go?" I asked, twisting in my seat to look back. Mom frowned, checking the mirrors. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. We drove the rest of the way to Albuquerque in silence. When we pulled into my aunt's driveway, Mom let out a long breath like she'd been holding it the whole time. The next morning, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was written in neat, blocky handwriting. "Stay safe. The road is dangerous, but there are still good people watching over you." There was no signature, but I knew it was from Jack. When Mom tried to contact the other truckers to thank them, none of them remembered anyone named Jack. One of them even said, "Lady, there was no truck like the one you're describing out there last night. To this day, I don't know who or what Jack was. Maybe he was just a regular guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Or maybe he was something more. But I do know one thing. Without him, we wouldn't have made it out of that night alive. Wherever you are, Jack, thank you. I've been driving trucks for over a decade now, crisscrossing the United States with everything from livestock to electronics. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the night can be both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it's peaceful. No traffic, no distractions, just the hum of my engine and the dark road ahead. On the other hand, it's lonely as hell, and sometimes the quiet feels like it's watching you. This night started like any other. I was hauling a shipment from New Orleans to Jacksonville, Florida, a familiar route for me. It was a humid Louisiana evening, the kind where the air sticks to your skin, and the highway was nearly deserted. Just the occasional glow of headlights coming from the opposite direction, cutting through the darkness like fleeting ghosts. But as the hours dragged on, the quiet started to weigh on me. And then, the worst possible thing happened. I felt my stomach twist. I needed a bathroom, urgently. The problem with driving at night is that your options are limited. Gas stations and rest stops are few and far between, and even when you find one, you're rolling the dice on cleanliness. I considered pulling over and finding a patch of woods, but just as I was about to, I spotted a flickering Shell station sign up ahead. Relief washed over me. The sign promised a truck stop and restrooms, which sounded like a jackpot. But as I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot, my relief turned into unease. This wasn't your typical bustling truck stop. The station was small, barely more than a shack with a couple of pumps, and it looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The lights were dim and flickering, casting strange, jerky shadows across the cracked asphalt. Still, I was desperate. I parked my truck near the edge of the lot, grabbed my phone for light, and stepped out. That's when I noticed it. A smell. It wasn't the usual mix of gasoline and oil. This was sour, heavy, almost metallic, and it clung to the back of my throat like a bad memory. The parking lot was littered with broken glass and patches of weeds poking through the cracks. As I walked toward the back of the station, I saw dark stains on the pavement. Oil spills. Maybe. But they were too thick, too fresh. The restroom was at the far end of the building, a metal door with peeling paint. It looked warped, like it hadn't been opened in years. For a moment I thought about turning back, but the discomfort in my gut pushed me forward. When I opened the door, the smell hit me like a freight train. It was so strong I had to stagger back, clutching my nose. I gagged, almost losing it right there. But there was no turning back now. I tied my bandana around my face, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The room was dark and cold, unnaturally cold for a Louisiana night. My phone's flashlight barely lit the space, but it was enough to see what was inside. A body lay sprawled on the floor, right in the center of the room. It was a man, middle-aged, his face twisted in an expression of pure terror. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his clothes were soaked with something dark and sticky. Blood. But that wasn't the worst part. Written on the walls in jagged, smeared letters were words I couldn't fully make out. Some looked like symbols, others were in English. Help. Run. It's coming. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. The noise was coming from behind me near the door. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A shadow, tall and hunched, slipping out of sight. Panic surged through me. I spun around and bolted out of the bathroom, stumbling into the parking lot. The air felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on me. And then I saw them. More stains, leading away from the bathroom and toward the woods behind the station. I didn't wait to find out what they meant. I ran to my truck, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. Just as I climbed inside, I heard it again, that dragging sound. This time, it was louder, closer. Inside the truck, I locked the doors and grabbed my phone to call 911. No signal. Of course. My headlights were still on, illuminating the lot, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the light, just barely visible. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was tilted like it was studying me. I froze, unable to look away. Then, slowly, it started moving forward. Its gait was uneven, jerky, like a puppet on strings. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. The engine sputtered, refusing to turn over. Come on, I whispered, slamming my hands on the steering wheel. The figure was closer now, almost at the edge of the headlights. Finally, the engine roared to life. I threw the truck into gear and slammed on the gas, peeling out of the lot. The tires screeched, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else, a scream, high-pitched and inhuman. I didn't look back. Hours later, I pulled into a well-lit truck stop, shaking and drenched in sweat. I called the police, told them everything. They promised to investigate and took my statement. But when they called me back, their response sent chills down my spine. There was nothing there, the officer said. No body, no stains, no writing on the walls. The station's been abandoned for over a decade. I didn't argue. What was the point? I know what I saw, what I heard. But even now, I can't make sense of it. All I know is I'll never drive that route again. And no matter how far I go, I'll never forget the way it felt. The heaviness in the air, the shadows that moved on their own, and the figure that almost had me. The night might be peaceful, but it's never truly empty. Being a long-haul trucker isn't just a job, it's a lifestyle. You spend more time with the hum of the engine and the endless blacktop than you do with actual people. The road becomes your home, your confidant, and sometimes it turns on you. That night, I was hauling high-tech equipment from Las Vegas to Boise, Idaho. It was a quiet night, the kind truckers dream of. Clear skies, empty highways, and the soft static of the CB radio to keep me company. I'd been on the road since early morning, and by 1:30 a.m. I needed to take my required break. I spotted a wide pull-off along the US 93, a perfect spot to stretch my legs and grab a bite. I pulled the rig over, cut the engine, and logged my stop. The silence hit me like a wall. No distant hum of passing cars, no wind, just nothing. I stepped out, stretching under the faint glow of the truck's lights, and climbed back into the cab to make a sandwich. I was halfway through it when I noticed headlights in my mirror. A beat-up old car rolled up behind my truck and stopped. The headlights stayed on, bright enough to make it impossible to see who was inside. My gut tensed. Trucks attract all kinds of attention. Curious strangers, thieves, or worse. I wasn't panicked, just on edge. The driver's door opened and someone stepped out. A tall figure, wearing a long, tattered coat. They moved slowly, deliberately, heading toward the back of my trailer. My hand instinctively went to the glove box where I kept my flashlight. I kept eating, trying to act like I hadn't noticed them. But my eyes never left the mirror. The figure stopped at the back of the trailer. Then they started rubbing it. Both hands pressed flat against the metal, moving in slow, circular motions. What the hell were they doing? I wasn't about to sit there and wait for whatever this was to escalate. I reached behind the seat, unlocking the box where I kept my pistol. I didn't plan to use it unless I had to, but having it made me feel safer. I tucked it into my waistband and grabbed my flashlight. Sliding out of the cab, I felt the chill of the night air immediately bite at my skin. I walked about 10 feet toward the trailer, the flashlight steady in my hand. "Hey," I called out, my voice firm but not aggressive. "What are you doing back there?" The figure froze. Slowly, they turned to face me, and that's when I got my first real look at them. It was a man, or at least he looked like one. His face was unnaturally pale, almost glowing in the dark. Long, stringy hair hung over his shoulders, and the top of his head was completely bald. But it was his smile that hit me the hardest, wide and toothy, like he knew something I didn't. "Just admiring your truck," he said, his voice light and airy, like he was making small talk. He didn't stop smiling. "Yeah, well, you can admire it from somewhere else," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step toward me, then another. His movements were smooth, almost too smooth, like he was gliding rather than walking. I raised the flashlight higher, my other hand inching toward the pistol tucked at my back. "Stop right there," I barked. He did, but his smile never wavered. He tilted his head, studying me like I was the strange one. "You don't have to be so rude," he said, his voice still calm, still friendly. "We just want to talk." "We?" My blood ran cold. Before I could respond, the truck rocked violently. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting over the trailer. My heart was pounding as I turned back to the man, only to find that he was now standing much closer. Too close. I backed away, fumbling to climb into the cab. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and sat there trying to catch my breath. But when I looked out the passenger window, my stomach dropped. A face was pressed against the glass. It wasn't his face. It was something worse. The face on the glass wasn't human. It was old, wrinkled, and twisted into a grotesque smile. The skin was stretched too tightly over the bone, and the eyes were nothing but black pits. She tilted her head, her grin widening as she tapped the glass with long, yellowed nails. I froze. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but my body wouldn't move. She leaned closer, her breath fogging up the window, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then, she let out a laugh, a high-pitched, shrill sound that made my skin crawl. On the driver's side, the man climbed onto the step, pressing his face against the window. His tongue slid across the glass, leaving a wet trail. "Open the door, kid," he said, his voice playful. "We just want to see what's inside." The truck rocked again, harder this time, as if something heavy had landed on the roof. I grabbed the gun from my waistband, my hands shaking as I pointed it toward the window. "Leave! Now!" I shouted. The woman's smile didn't falter. She just kept tapping, her eyes locked on mine. The man chuckled, his breath fogging up the driver's side window. "Oh, come on, don't be like that," he said. "Let us in." The pounding on the roof grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't tell what was up there, but it felt like it was trying to tear the cab apart. My heart was racing as I jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine. The woman's face disappeared from the passenger window, and the man jumped down from the step, still grinning. But I didn't wait for them to make their next move. I slammed my foot on the gas, the truck roaring as it sped forward. In the side mirrors, I saw them standing in the road, watching me. The woman raised a hand, waving slowly as if saying goodbye. Then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the outskirts of Boise, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon. When I finally pulled into a truck stop, I stepped out to inspect the rig. On the side of the trailer, scratched into the metal, were 3 words: "See you soon." I haven't taken that route since, and I never will. When I first started driving trucks, my dad used to tell me all kinds of stories about the dangers of the job. He'd talk about guys he knew who'd keep guns in their rigs for protection. Back then, the roads were wild, or at least that's how he made it sound. Now, the company I work for has a strict no-weapons policy. They say it's to protect us from lawsuits if something goes wrong, but that doesn't make you feel any safer when you're out there on your own in the middle of the night. I'm Tom, 34 years old, and I've been driving trucks for a decade. Let me tell you, the road isn't just asphalt and white lines. It's full of surprises, and not all of them are good. This story isn't one I usually share, but it's been haunting me ever since it happened. It started like any other job. I had a delivery for a Kohl's distribution center out in Gary, Indiana. The route would take me through Chicago, and anyone who's driven through there knows the traffic is a nightmare. By the time I hit the outskirts of the city, it was around 9:30 at night. The highway was finally starting to clear up, and I thought I'd make good time. That's when the GPS threw a wrench in my plans. Road closed ahead, the screen said, rerouting me through a detour. It was supposed to add 35, maybe 40 minutes tops to my trip. No big deal, right? The detour started out fine, just some extra twists and turns. But as I drove further, the roads got narrower, the houses more spread out and the streetlights fewer and farther between. I felt like I'd been dropped into a ghost town. Most of the houses I passed were boarded up, and the ones that weren't looked like they hadn't been lived in for years. At first, I thought it was just an old neighborhood, but the deeper I went, the eerier it got. My headlights caught glimpses of broken windows, overgrown lawns, and graffiti-covered walls. It didn't feel right. My gut was screaming at me to turn around, but there wasn't anywhere to go. The GPS insisted this was the only way through. Then, as I turned a corner, I saw them. Kids, maybe teens, hanging out on a crumbling porch. There were 5 or 6 of them, and they all turned to stare at my truck like they'd been expecting me. It was unsettling, but I figured they were just kids being nosy. I kept driving, but the unease stuck with me. A few blocks later, I spotted brake lights ahead. A car was parked right in the middle of the street, blocking my way. I slowed down, thinking maybe someone had broken down or stopped to check directions. That's when I noticed the shadows moving along the sides of the road. Figures, 3 on my left, 2 on my right. All of them wore hoodies with the hoods pulled tight over their heads. My heart started pounding. I'd heard stories about setups like this, but I never thought I'd get caught in one. My first instinct was to back up, but when I glanced in the mirrors, I saw another car pull up behind me. Its headlights flared, locking me in. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a trap. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight I thought I might break it. The guys in hoodies moved closer, one of them walking straight up to my driver's side door. Another tapped on the passenger window. It wasn't a polite knock, it was a sharp, angry rap. "Get out of the truck," the one on my side barked, his voice muffled by the hood covering most of his face. Then, he raised something that made my stomach drop. It was a gun, pointed directly at my head. I froze. My brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body refused to move. "I said get out!" he shouted again, slamming the gun against the glass for emphasis. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear him, but I forced myself to nod. Slowly, I raised my hands off the wheel to show I wasn't going to fight. My fingers felt numb as I reached for the seatbelt. "Keep those hands where I can see them," the guy yelled, waving the gun closer to my face. I unbuckled the belt and slid out of the seat, my legs trembling like they might give out. The moment I was on the ground, 2 of them grabbed me, shoving me up against the side of the truck. One of them patted me down, yanking my wallet and phone out of my pockets. Meanwhile, another guy climbed into the truck's cab. I could hear the engine rev as he got comfortable in the driver's seat. "What's in the load?" one of them asked, stepping in front of me. He was shorter than the others, but stocky, his voice dripping with aggression. "Just clothes." "It's just clothes," I stammered, hoping they'd believe me and leave it at that. He nodded to the others. "All right, let's roll." Before I could even process what was happening, the guy with the gun motioned for me to start walking. "Go. Back the way you came. Don't turn around." I didn't argue. I just started walking, putting one foot in front of the other. My legs felt like jelly, and my throat was so dry I could barely swallow. Every step away from them felt like a miracle. I kept expecting to hear the crack of a gunshot behind me, but all I heard was the sound of my own breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to glance back. The street was empty. No cars, no men in hoodies, just darkness. Relief started to wash over me, but it didn't last long. I realized I had no idea where I was. My phone was gone, my truck was gone, and I was stranded in the middle of a neighborhood that felt like it belonged in a horror movie. I kept walking, hoping I'd find something familiar. That's when I saw the bar. It was an old, run-down place with a flickering neon sign that barely spelled out open, even though it was clearly abandoned. Desperate for shelter, I pushed the door open. It creaked like something out of a haunted house, and the smell of mildew hit me immediately. Inside, the place was a wreck. Tables overturned, broken glass everywhere, and the faint stench of something rotten. I found a corner to sit in, trying to catch my breath. But then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the bar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just the sound of shuffling, like someone dragging their feet. I wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped, but the air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I stayed frozen in the corner, straining my ears to catch any other sound. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, almost like someone was muttering under their breath. I wasn't about to stick around and find out who, or what, was there. I bolted for the door, kicking a chair out of my way as I ran. The sound of splintering wood echoed behind me, and I swore I heard hurried footsteps following. The moment I hit the street, I ran as fast as I could, my boots slapping against the cracked pavement, my lungs burned. But I didn't stop until the bar was far behind me. When I finally slowed down, I realized I'd made it to a stretch of road that looked vaguely familiar. The streetlights were still sparse, but I could make out a small gas station up ahead. The place looked abandoned, with a single flickering bulb illuminating the entrance. I approached cautiously, pushing the door open. The inside was trashed. Shelves toppled over, cans scattered across the floor, and a register hanging open with nothing inside. But there was a phone. It hung on the wall, an old payphone with the receiver dangling like someone had used it and left in a hurry. I grabbed it and pressed it to my ear, half expecting it to be dead. To my surprise, I heard a dial tone. My fingers fumbled as I tried to remember the number for 911, and just as I started dialing, the phone went dead. The silence was deafening. Then came the sound of tires screeching in the distance. I peeked out the window and saw headlights. It was the same car that had blocked me earlier, creeping down the street like it was searching for something, or someone. I ducked behind the counter, my heart racing. The car slowed as it passed the gas station, its headlights sweeping over the broken windows. I held my breath, waiting for it to move on. Finally, it disappeared down the road, but I knew they'd be back. I had to get out of there. I slipped out the back door and into the darkness. The only path ahead was a wooded area behind the gas station. I hesitated, but staying on the road wasn't an option. As I pushed through the trees, the forest felt alive. Branches snapped underfoot, but it wasn't just me making the noise. Something, or someone, was moving through the trees, keeping pace with me. I picked up the pace, practically running now, until I stumbled onto another road. This one had no streetlights, just a long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the dark. I didn't have a choice. I started walking, every shadow and sound putting me on edge. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, completely still. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like a statue, blocking the road ahead. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but where would I go? Back into the woods? No way. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I don't want any trouble." No response. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes locked on the figure. It was a man, tall and broad, wearing a long coat that seemed to blend into the night. As I got closer, I noticed his face, or lack of one. His head was covered by some kind of mask, smooth and featureless, like a blank slate. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. Still nothing. Then he raised an arm, pointing at me. I don't know why, but that simple motion sent a wave of terror through me. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of a building in the distance. It was a police station. I practically fell through the door, gasping for breath. The officers inside looked up, startled. "Help!" I managed to choke out. "I've been robbed, my truck, my phone, everything." They sat me down, gave me water, and listened as I told them everything. About the ambush, the stolen truck, and the strange figure on the road. To my surprise, they didn't look shocked. One of them, a grizzled older man, just nodded. "We've had reports like this before," he said, leaning back in his chair. Gangs use abandoned neighborhoods to set traps for drivers. As for the guy in the mask, you're not the first to see him either. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Urban legend around here, he replied. They call him the Watcher. Shows up when people are in danger, but no one knows if he's there to help or something else. The room fell silent. They never found my truck or the cargo. I was lucky to keep my job after explaining what happened, but I wasn't the same after that night. Every time I get behind the wheel now, I think about the Watcher and the men who took everything from me. The road used to feel like freedom. Now it feels like a trap waiting to spring. And every shadow I see in my mirrors makes me wonder if he's still out there, watching.